Okay, what were some of the causes for the Truman Doctrine?
The Truman Doctrine came about at the end of the Second World War, when the threat of communism loomed large in the horizon. Already, communism had taken over most of the Eastern Bloc nations. At that particular time, the British government, on their own, were sending money and military aid to Greece, the country of Greece. They were pretty much bankrupt and were unable to do it anymore. So the United States stepped in, and a fellow by the name of George Kennan, who at that time was chief mission officer to Russia, wrote an outstanding report to President Truman and his people in office. One of the reports he wrote under the pseudonym X, just simply X, okay? From that was formulated the Truman Doctrine. Now, George Kennan advocated political and economic sanctions against these countries. Inevitably, what happened was that all this money went for military aid. But what the United States was worried about then and for years and years to come was what was called the domino effect. In other words, if Greece falls to communism, Turkey falls to communism. If Turkey falls to communism, another country will fall. And the same thing was, prevailing in Vietnam. That's why we were involved in Vietnam all those years later.
What happened after the Truman Doctrine was created and put into place?
We ended up supplying military aid to the Greek monarchy, and they were able to stop communist aggression in Greece. And it never went any further than Turkey, or into Turkey.
Why was this so important to the U.S.?
Well, because there was this threat of communism. The Cold War had started. There was not a hot war anymore where battles are being fought, but the Cold War had begun. And as Winston Churchill stated in one of his great speeches in this country, an iron curtain had been spread across Europe, and the Cold War had began. But we always perceived communism for all those years as a threat to the world, and that's why it was so important. It wasn't many years later that the communists in Korea invaded South Korea. That happened in the early 50s. So that was the prevailing thought, and it was that thought that kept on for years and years and years, that you had to stop it somewhere.
What did this do in effect to the Cold War?
Well, it kind of put everything at a standstill, except for engagements like in Korea and Vietnam. No longer were communist sympathizers able to just simply overrun any country they so chose, like Greece, for instance. We were able to stop them there. We were able to stop them through military might in Korea, only the southern part, not the northern part. We weren't able to stop them in Vietnam. We lost there.
How did this affect the people in the U.S. at the time and now?
Well, I think again that as the Cold War began, there was this huge threat of communism. The McCarthy hearings were not too many years in the future, where everybody was accused of being a communist sympathizer. There was just this huge threat of nuclear war. Both we had atomic weapons, by then Russia had atomic weapons, and there had to be something put into effect to stop this. Truman took George Kennan's message to Congress, and it officially became the Truman Doctrine. It was some way to stop the spread of communism.